MARCKALADA. The first mention of America in the Mediterranean area, circa 1340. The Chronica Universalis written by the Milanese friar Galvanius della Fiamma, in Italian, Galvano Fiamma, circa 1345, contains astonishing mentions of Greenland, an island at that time virtually unknown in the Mediterranean area, and of a terra caedicita Markalada, situated west of Greenland. This land is recognizable as the Markland mentioned by some Icelandic sources, and identified by scholars as the Atlantic coast of Labrador or Newfoundland. Galvanius's references, likely derived from oral sources heard in Genoa, are the first mentions of the American continent in the Mediterranean region, and give evidence of early circulation, outside the Nordic area, of information about northwestern lands beyond Iceland. Galvanius della Fiamma was a Dominican friar, who lived in Milan and was connected to the Visconti family, which held at the time the lordship of the city. He wrote several literary works in Latin, mainly on historical subjects. His testimony is effective on Milanese contemporary facts, about which he has a first-hand knowledge. However, when Galvanius deals with the past or with non-Milanese contexts, he gathers different information with little critical judgment, and his worth as a historian is dependent on the sources he exploits. The Chronica Universalis is thought to be one of his later works, perhaps the last one, and was left unfinished and unperfected. The approximate date is 1339 to 1345. The original plan, set out in the prologue, envisaged including the history of the whole world from the creation to Galvanius's times, in 15 books. However, the actual work is significantly shorter than previously announced. The narrative stops in the middle of Book 4, ending with the biblical King Joas, 4 Kings 11-12. There is no evidence that any further sections were ever written. In 2013, Sant'Ambrogio Sangarle Parisi first identified Galvanius's Chronica Universalis and drew attention to it. The work, written in Latin, is still unpublished. An edition is planned, in the context of a scholarly and educational program promoted by the University of Milan. It is preserved in a single manuscript held by a private owner, who kindly gave me permission to photograph it. The manuscript was written in Milan at the very end of the 14th century by a copyist named Pietro Gioldi, Patrusti Gioldi's, who was also responsible for transcribing other historical works by Galvanius. He apparently planned a complete edition of Fiamma's Chronicles, in several copies. The manuscripts of Galvanius's works provided by Gioldi are often defective, not so much because of his inadequacy as a copyist, but rather because he had to deal with inconsistent models. There is evidence that he used some work-in-progress manuscripts by Galvanius himself, never finished, sometimes not easy to read, enriched by marginal notes and flyleaves. In this situation, Gioldi made many mistakes in transcribing uncommon words, for example, personal and geographic names, and left open several problems in the general structure of the book: duplications of sentences, lack of chapter numbers, incongruous internal cross-references, etc. However, he was a professional copyist, hence quite correct where Latin wording was more easily understandable, or when the direct model was unambiguously readable. As a matter of fact, Gioldi's attitude towards the text seems remarkably conservative, and testifies in favor of his substantial fidelity to the model. The mention of Greenland and Markalada occurs in the third book, which includes the third age of humankind, from Abraham to David, according to the traditional Augustinian and Orosian partition. The narrative is structured on the grid of biblical chronology, which Galvanius complements with secular history and mythology. In addition to the chronologic plot, in the third book the writer inserts a long geographical excursus, mainly dealing with exotic areas, the Far East, Arctic lands, oceanic islands, Africa. His sources are both traditional ones, for example Isidorus and Solinus, and recent accounts of travelers, such as Marco Polo and Odoric of Pordenone. Sometimes he quotes uncommon works, such as the Epistolae of the Franciscan John of Montecorvino, missionary to China, and the Tractatus de Mappa by the Genoese priest and cartographer John of Carignano, a treatise that for a long time was considered lost, but partially survives through Galvanius's extracts. The writer is also aware of the medieval scientific notions about climate zones, and is interested in theoretical discussions about the habitability of non-temperate lands. He considers both southern, subequinoctial, and northern lands, subpollo, i.e. Polo, Artico, in order to demonstrate that people live there as well. In this context he mentions two lands named Groenlandia and Markalada. Here is the text, with an English translation, in italics the most relevant passages, which we are going to discuss. Et iconoctores quad subequinoctiali sunt montes altissimi, ubi sunt habitationes temperat ration ventorum aut umbra montium, aut ration hedifidiorum mirabilis grosce, Out ration cavernarum subterranearum in balibus. Sunt etium sub equinoctiali multinsel valde temperate, vel ration fluminum, vel ration nemrum, vel ration ventorum, vel propter alias aliquas causis nobis ignotas. Et peri ration sub polio artico vel circus sunt habitationes, non obstandi frigor per maximo, valde temperate, in tantum quad homines ibi more non possunt. Sicut potet de Hibernia. Et hoc evenet propter aliquas causis nobis occultas. Et de hoc express loquitur Marcus Paulus Tysons quad est quad dam deserta magnum per ex aldi et ubi nicil nascitur, nec granum, nec vinum, homines vivant divi nationibus avium et animalium et equitant servos. Postea versus tramontanum est meroxianum. Ubi sunt insel multin quibus nascener falcones peregrinae gyrofalci in maxima quantitate. Et iste insel sunt tantum versus tramontanum quad stella tramontana remanita tergo versus meridium. Et dicunt marinarii qui conversanter in mari dati et Norvegi quad ultra Norvegium versus tramontanum est Islandia. Et ad est insula dicta Groenlandia ubi tramontana stata tergo versus meridium. Ubi unis episcopus dominator. Ibi non est granum nec vinum nec fructus, sed vivant de lacte et carnibus et piscibus. Habent domus subterraneas in quibus habitant, nec audent clamere vel aliquam rumorum facere ni besti eos audirant et devorerant. Ibi sunt ursi albi magnanimus, cinadent primer et naufragus ad litus conducunt. Ubi nascenter falcones albi magni volitus cimituntur ad imperatorum tartarorum decada. And versus occidens est terra cadem dicitur Marckalada. Ubi gigantes habitant et sunt hedificia habentia lapides saxios dam grands quad nullus homo possit in hedificio collicare nisi essent gigantes maximi. Ibi sunt arbores virides et animalia et aves multnimus. Necum quam fui aliquis marinarius quita est terra nec deus condictionibus aliquid sire potort procerto. Ex his omnibus apparit quad sub polio artico est habitatio. Our authorities say that under the equator there are very high mountains, where there are temperate settlements, made possible by winds, or by the shadow of the mountains, or by the remarkable thickness of the walls, or by underground caves in valleys. At the equator there are also many islands that are truly temperate because of the rivers, or the marshes, or the winds, or for reasons that are unknown to us. And for a similar reason there are settlements beneath or around the Arctic pole, despite the very intense cold. These settlements are so temperate that people cannot die there. This fact is well known for Ireland. The reasons why this happens are unknown to us. Marco Polo speaks explicitly about this when he says that there is a certain desert 40 days across where nothing grows, neither wheat nor wine, but the people live by hunting birds and animals, and they ride deers. Further northwards there is the ocean, a sea with many islands where a great quantity of peregrine falcons and gyrfalcons live. These islands are located so far north that the polar star remains behind you, towards the south. Sailors who frequent the seas of Denmark and Norway say that northwards, beyond Norway, there is Iceland. Further ahead there is an island named Groenlandia, where the polar star remains behind you, towards the south. The governor of this island is a bishop. In this land there is neither wheat nor wine nor fruit. People live on milk, meat and fish. They dwell in subterranean houses, and do not venture to speak loudly or to make any noise, for fear that wild animals hear and devour them. There live huge white bears, which swim in the sea and bring shipwrecked sailors to the shore. There live white falcons capable of great flights, which are sent to the Emperor of Katai. Further westwards there is another land, named MARCKALADA, where giants live. In this land there are buildings with such huge slabs of stone that nobody could build with them, except huge giants. There are also green trees, animals and a great quantity of birds. However, no sailor was ever able to know anything for sure about this land or about its features. From all these facts it is clear that there are settlements at the Arctic pole. About the southern lands where people live, despite the supposed high temperature, Galvanius is deriving his information from those whom he generically calls auctors, i.e. the geographic tradition passed to the Middle Ages from late antiquity, represented by Solinus and Isidorus, and, more recently, Bartholomaeus Anglicus, Peter of Abano, Benzo of Alessandria, and others. For what concerns the northern lands, the major authority is Marco Polo, explicitly quoted, and especially his description of the regions north of Karakorum, the royal city of the Mongols. We report the corresponding passage in the Latin translation, before 1320, of the Dominican friar Pipinus of Bologna. This very widespread version seems likely to have been the direct source of Galvanius, who was a Dominican as well. Postisessima civitate Coracora metamonti auci, persiegter per aquilanarum plagum per campus triabong, que hubent in longitudine excel dietas. In quol loci vocantur mecareth, qui subiecti sunt magno comet habent tartarorum mores. Sunt autem silvestris homines, carnibus vesciuntur animalium que in venetionibus capent, et specialiter servorum, de quibus copium habent, Quos etiam domesticum et factos domesticos equitant, Blado caret et vino. In estate Venetianum maximum habent avium et silvestrium animalium, hiem vero animalia et volatilia cocta habent, et on dissident propter frigus maximum regionis ilius. Post terminum alarum excel dietarum prevenitur ad meroxianum, iuxta quod sunt montes in quibus heredii seu falcones peregrini nidos habent, Ciond ad magnicam curiam differner. In monte basilis null ali reprender aves nisi heredii predicti et avium species altera dicunter. Bargelac, quibus pascitur heredii, avsil grand sun ut predices, petis papagallis similes, quodem vero habent ut rodii et sunt velocis magnic volatus. In insulis autem maris ilius girlfulci nascenter in multitudin maxima, qui ad magnum com differenter, girlfulci autem qui de Christianorum terras differenter ad Tartaros non portender ad magnum com, quia is supermagum habundat, sed differter ad Tartaros alios qui Armenes et Cumanes son affines. In illis partibus insul sunt que tantum sunt ad Aquilinum posit, quad polmus articus, silicet stella transmontana, estis ad plagum meridionalem. Nevertheless, a part of Galvanius's narrative, the part we have highlighted in italics quoting the Chronica Universalis, does not depend on Marco Polo. Our writer states that sailors who frequent the seas of Denmark and Norway, marinarii qui conversantur in mari dati et Norvegi, provide information about some lands of the far north, Islandia, which is said to lie ultra Norvegium versus Tramontanum, then Groenlandia, whose geographical position can be deduced by the adverb bond, namely beyond Islandia in the same direction, and which is described as the extreme north, where the polar star is left behind. Seafaring sources are also entitled to be the origin of the last passage, devoted to MARCKALADA, which lies west of Groenlandia. Unlike the information about Islandia and Groenlandia, the news about MARCKALADA are admittedly vague. There is hearsay, but nothing for sure. Necumquam fui aliquis marinarius quita est terra necta eus condictionibus aliquid sire poturit procerto. The existence of Iceland, Islandia, was not unknown to the geographic culture of medieval Europe, one of the most widespread and influential encyclopedias of the time. The De Proprietatibus Rerum by Bartholomeus Anglicus, also quoted by Galvanius, devoted a paragraph to it, and an island with a similar name is depicted in early cartographic documents, like the Cottonian World Map and the Al-Idrisi World Map. On the contrary, the names of the other two lands, Groenlandia and MARCKALADA, are not found in any continental geographic treatise or map, at least until the 15th century. While the reference to MARCKALADA in the Chronica Universalis is unique, Galvanius mentions Groenlandia, in the alternative spelling Groenlandia, Groenlandia, a second time, within a list of islands located north or west of Ireland. Insula dicta Thanatos. Anglia insula habet iuxta, modaquaxiano interiecto, quandam insulam parm que desider Thanatos, terra siquidem fertilize, abundance fermento. Ibi nullus serpens vivit sed terra illiquocum portata serpentis interficit. Similiter desiderta insula Galani que est in oriente iuxta populus caramans. Insula dicta Groenlandia. Ultra Islandiam familiaria firam est insula dicta Groenlandia ubi nascender falcones albi et ursi albi. Ibi non nascitur nec ranum nec finum, gabundat piscibus et lacti. Et fear ad ipsos nullus est accessus, et navis que lux semel vidit tot concutitur fluctibus quad numquam ulterius potus navigia perficere. Insula tile posita sub pollo artico. Sub pollo artico est insula dicta tile veltilin, deque dicit salinus quad non potest habitari, quia quando tempori sol abariete vidit in librum per sex mensis sol non viditer, per alios sex mensis continu vident solum. Ultra hanc insulam secundum salinum est mare pigrum et concretum. Here a translation of the chapter on Groenlandia, the island named Groenlandia. Beyond Iceland, traveling 1,000 miles, there is an island named Groenlandia. In this land live white falcons and white bears. Neither wheat nor wine grow there. There is plenty of fish and milk. It is almost impossible to reach this people. When a ship goes there, it is so much tossed by the waves, that it cannot make any further sea voyage. The chapters about Thanatos and Thyle are taken from Solinus's Collectanea, where they occur in succession. The chapter about Groenlandia has no parallel in Solinus, or in any continental geographic treatise of the Middle Ages. Gathering together the information provided in both chapters, Groenlandia is described as a land difficult to access and impossible to cultivate, populated by wild animals, whose inhabitants harvest food through hunting, fishing and poor husbandry, and lead a hard and miserable life in poverty and in constant fear. The Groenlandia, which lies ultra Islandiam can only be Greenland. The distance provided by Galvanius, Milliaria Firam, is sufficiently approximate, if calculated from the western coast of Iceland to the medieval eastern settlement in Greenland. west of Cape Farewell. On 2 occasions Galvanius qualifies this land as insula, a notion that was not taken for granted at the time. Although Adam of Bremen, who provides the first historical mention of it, speaks of Greenland as an island, in the Konungsskogsia, King's Mirror, an Old Norse speculum of the 13th century focused on the North Atlantic area, the question of whether such land is mainland or an island is treated as controversial, and ultimately Greenland is considered mainland. South of the Alps, Greenland, as Grönland, Grönlanden, Grönlandia, is mentioned only in the papal documents which granted jurisdiction over Scandinavia to the archbishops of Hamburg, dated 1053, 1055 and 1133, whose wording was obviously dictated by the archbishopric itself. There is no further evidence of more precise knowledge of this land. Concerning the Terra Caediciter Marcalada, not specifically defined insula, as Galvanius does for Greenland. No other land seems to be taken in account, except the Markland mentioned in a scant number of medieval sources, all emanating from Iceland and all indeed placing it to the southwest of Greenland. Most of the slight differences in spelling between Galvanius Marcalada and the Icelandic Markland do not represent a problem. It is impossible to know if such differences derive from Galvanius's sources, or if they should be ascribed to Galvanius himself or to the copyist of the manuscript. As we said, Gioldi often miswrote personal and geographical names he was not familiar with, but slavishly transcribed his model where the wording was plain. Apparently, this is the case. The copyist might have miswritten the name of the land, but there is no reason to think that he modified the rest of the sentence, a behavior which would be unusual for him. The only element of the spelling that strikes as odd is the grapheme ck, extremely rare in Italian manuscripts of the 14th century and unique in the whole Chronica Universalis. The use of ck implies an anomalous pronunciation, strengthened or stressed, of the guttural sound. Such an uncommon and isolated trait is unlikely to be a creation of Galvanius or Gioldi, and its singularity generates the suspect that it depends on the persistence of a previous source. All the medieval Nordic sources reporting mention of Markland are well known to scholars. However, we shall briefly summarize them. 1. In the Erik Saga Rotha, Erik the Red Saga, Markland is mentioned twice. 1. The hero Thorfinn Karlsefni and his people, coming from Helluland, sailed for 2 days before a northerly wind and sighted land ahead. This was a heavily wooded country abounding with animals. There was an island to the southeast, where they found bears, and so they named it Bjarn Isle. They named the wooded mainland itself Markland. 2. Coming back from Vinland, Thorfinn Karlsefni and his people set sail before a southerly wind and reached Markland, when they came upon 5 Skrellings, a bearded man, 2 women, and 2 children. Karlsefni and his men captured the 2 boys, but the others got away and sank down into the ground. They took the boys with them, taught them their own language, and baptized them. The boys said that their mother was called Vitild and their father Avgur. The boys said that the land of the Skrellings was ruled by 2 kings, one of whom was called Avaldamon and the other Valdidita. They said that there were no houses there and that people lived in caves or holes in the ground. The text is preserved in the Hauksbok, AM 544-42, written in 1306-8, and in the Skalholtsbok, AM 557-42. Written about 1420. The more recent manuscript is somewhat more conservative than the older one. The original text is thought to go back to the 13th century, although the narrative matter refers to the end of the 10th century. 2. In the Grönlandinga Saga, Saga of the inhabitants of Greenland, the hero Leif Erikson and his people, coming from Helluland, reached a country which is described as flat and wooded land, with white sandy beaches wherever they went, and the land sloped gently down to the sea. Leif said, "This country shall be named after its natural resources, it shall be called Markland." The oldest manuscript is the Flatty Jarbok, Copenhagen, Det Kongelige Bibliotek, GKS 1005 Fall, completed in 1387. The original text is also thought to go back to the 13th century and the narrative matter to the end of the 10th century. 3. The Skal's Annal, Annals of Iceland, Ms. AM 420-42, written in 1356 or later. For the year 1347 report this reference, a craft came from Greenland which was smaller in size than small vessels that trade to Iceland. It came into the entrance of Strom Fjord, on the south side of Snæfellsnes, Iceland. It had no anchor. There were 17 men on board who had been on a voyage to Markland and later had been driven by gales to this land. This information is recalled, with small changes, in the later Gotskogs Annal and Flatty Jørundal. 4. Markland is also mentioned in the description of the world, Heimslysing, conventionally named Kurzweltbeschreibung by Rudolf Simek, reported in the manuscript AM 736 I42, written about 1300, and in some later witnesses. The same description is also premised to the account of the journey, Leith Arvisr, by Nicholas Bergson from Munkhothvira, Oldest manuscript, AM 194 8vo, late 14th century. This text says, south from Greenland is Helluland, then Markland. Not far from there is Vinland. Some people suppose that this land is an offshoot of Africa. At the end of the passage, the version of the Leith Arvisor comments, if this be so, then the outer ocean, i.e., the ocean surrounding the disk of the earth, must fall in between Vinland and Markland, a sentence which is not found in the oldest manuscript of the Kurzweltbeschreibung and is considered by scholars as a later addition. Other Nordic descriptions of the world, derived from the Kurzweltbeschreibung, also contain similar information. These mentions of American lands in Icelandic cosmographic treatises are thought to derive from the saga narratives. The adventure genre is reduced into the fold of scientific literature. All these scant sources are Icelandic. No mention of the name Markland has ever been reported outside of the Nordic area. Scholars agree in identifying Markland, just like Vinland and Helluland, as some parts of the Atlantic coast of North America, where Icelanders and Greenlanders made explorations and marginal settlements, as is demonstrated by archaeological evidence. Markland is usually assumed to be Labrador or Newfoundland, Helluland Baffin Island or Labrador, Vinland Newfoundland or some southern seaside. This is obviously a matter for specialists, and we do not dare to enter the field. According to the sagas, Markland took its name from the forests and is supposed to mean wooded land. The MARCKALADA described by Galvanius is also rich of trees, Ibi sunt arboris virides, and animals live there, as in the Markland of Eric's Saga Rotha. These details could be standard, as distinctive of any good land, but they are not trivial, because the common feature of northern regions is to be bleak and barren, as actually Greenland is in Galvanius's account, or as Iceland is described by Adam of Bremen. However, other details are somewhat different from the image of Markland provided by the sagas. Galvanius apparently contaminates traits which Nordic narratives connected to other lands, as is usual with hearsay. The Lapide Saxe Grands recall the description of Helluland in the Eric's Saga Rotha and in Grönlandinga Saga. In this land Thorfinn Karlsefni found many slabs of stone so huge that 2 men could stretch out on them sole to sole. The giants who are said to inhabit Markkalada are common in Old Norse epic traditions, although they are usually reported to live northeastward, and not westward. An exception is the Bartar Saga Snæfellsnes, which sets giant people in Helluland. A similar contamination apparently occurs in Galvanius's description of Greenland as well. The domus subterranei are similar to those where the Skrellings escape after encountering Thorfinn Karlsefni in Markland, according to the Eric's Saga Rotha, or to the subterranean spelunks where the Icelanders dwell, according to Adam of Bremen. The Eric's Saga Rotha also reports that Ursi Albi Magni live in an island close to Markland. The lack of wheat and wine and the nourishment of the dwellers, milk, meat and fish, find a partial parallelism in Marco Polo's narrative, Carnibus Vescinturani Maliu. Blado Caron et Vino, as well as the information about the polar star startlingly visible southwards. The hint about the bishopric government of Greenland might echo what Adam of Bremen says of Iceland, Episcopum suum habent pro rege. As a matter of fact, however, a Greenlander bishopric is attested since ca. 1125, whatever its real authority. Such office was probably the most recognizable and comparable form of jurisdiction for a foreigner. Galvanius is a writer who cares about indicating his sources. At the very beginning of the Chronica Universalis, and of his other historiographical works he provides a bibliographic list of the books that he exploited to assemble his treatise, also declaring the Milanese library where he consulted each of them. Moreover, he scrupulously indicates the source of every piece of information reported in the chronicle, quoting the name of each author within the text, and underlining it. For the items concerning Greenland and Markkalada, Galvanius only refers to some generic auctors, for the non-specific discussion on habitability, and to Marco Polo, from whom, as we have already seen, he draws only part of the information. No other work fitting with similar contents is ever mentioned, neither in the text nor in the introductory bibliographic list. Galvanius does not quote Adam's Gesta Archiepiscoporum, and is not likely to have known this work, which never circulated out of the North European space. Moreover, in this passage he does not quote the De Proprietatibus Rerum by Bartholomaeus Anglicus, which he exploits elsewhere, the only encyclopedic source available to him which partially dealt with northwestern lands, namely Iceland. Therefore, we should trust Galvanius when he says that his information comes from an oral report, Die Kun, by Marinari Ike Conversandor and Mari Dati et Norvegi. Had he had some written source at his disposal, he would have most likely declared it, in light of the stronger authority he would have drawn from it. As a matter of fact, the details he reports about Greenland are consistent with the interests and concerns of sailors, the position of the polar star, visible southwards, the unusual mention of white bears bringing shipwrecked sailors ashore, which seems to echo seafaring stories, the trade in birds of prey, very lucrative at the time, The difficulty to reach Greenlanders, fear ad ipsos nullis est accessus, the storming waves which damage the ships and make them impossible to use for a later voyage, thus reducing the chances of their crew to make it back home. Another aspect compatible with oral sources is also the conflation of elements drawn from various stories, legendary or real, belonging to previous traditions on different lands, blended together and reassigned to a specific place. Further evidence demonstrates Galvanius's attention to oral sources, which he deems worthy of mention even in an erudite context such as the Chronica Universalis, a remarkably original aspect of its geography. Although, as we said, his description of the Far East is based on travel-written reports, in particular on those of Marco Polo, Odorico di Pordenone and John of Montecorvino. He also relates the information gathered from some Frater Simon Predicator qui in partibus celis moram contraccidanus v, otherwise unknown. Galvanius explicitly states that Frater Simon's testimony is oral, dicit, narrat, gabui exor. Furthermore, within the geographical section of the Chronica Universalis we find a schematic representation of the terrestrial parallels, the cardinal points and the direction of the winds. As a matter of fact, the table is based on scientific coordinates, but the scholarly names of the winds, Vulturnus, Africus, Favonius, etc., alternate with terms of seafaring origin, Lebeg, Shuroch, Mazdi, Levanth, Ponanth, Greco, certainly drawn from oral sources. Who are the Marinarii whom Galvanius indicates as his source? Another isolated hint in the geographic part of the Chronica Universalis suggests that Galvanius was not unfamiliar with sailors' stories. Speaking about some mountains with magnetic properties, he writes that their rocks extrahunt Clavos de Navi, a detail absent in his written sources and evidently drawn from seafaring experience. Galvanius, however, lived in Milan, an inland city, not exactly a customary destination for sailors. The most probable hypothesis, then, is that he is reporting first-hand or second-hand information coming from Genoa, the closest seaport to Milan. As a matter of fact, references to Genoese sources can be found elsewhere in the Chronica Universalis. As we said, Galvanius quotes the lost work of John of Carignano, which apparently had no diffusion outside of Genoa. Moreover, he refers to some Mappa Ianuensis, seemingly a planisphere including the Asiatic continent, as if he had it in his own hands. These two elements suggest that Galvanius might have spent some time in Genoa, where he could consult the planisphere and gather excerpts from John of Carignano's booklet. Although such a stay is not demonstrable, it is highly plausible in the context of Galvanius's life. Conversely, there is absolutely no evidence of his hypothetic travels or contacts in northern Europe, nor proof that he ever utilized written or oral sources of that provenance. Therefore, Galvanius's Marinarii were most likely Genoese, rather than Nordic. The Genoese were indeed the Marinarii par excellence for the Milanese audience of the writer. Besides, the Portolan charts drawn in Genoa and in Catalonia during the 14th century, like the famous maps by John of Carignano himself or by Angelino Dulciti, who is considered to be the link between Genoese cartographic practice and Majorca, offer a more advanced geographic representation of the north, such as could be obtained through direct contacts with those regions. A straightforward conclusion is that these notions about the northwest were acquired on the shipping routes to the British Isles and to the continental coasts of the North Sea. We have no evidence that Italian or Catalan seafarers ever reached Iceland or Greenland at that time, but they were certainly able to acquire from North European merchants goods of that origin, to be transported to the Mediterranean area. The Marinarii mentioned by Galvanius could be a point in favor of this hypothesis. The Genoese might have brought back to their city scattered news about these lands, some real and some fanciful, that they heard in the northern harbors. In the 13th and 14th centuries the Genoese sailors traveled far and wide, from China to East Africa to inner Morocco. It would be rather strange for them to have avoided the nearer routes of northern Europe, and if they did sail north, they must have surely reported what they heard from other sailors, Scottish, British, Danish, useful information to possibly open up new commercial routes. The geographic treatise by Ali ibn Musa ibn Said al-Maribi, written around 1250–70, gives evidence of the trade of white falcons and white bears from northern Europe to the Mediterranean Sea. Around it, Denmark, are small islands where falcons are found. To the west lies the island of White Falcons. Its length from west to east is about 7 days and its breadth about 4 days, and from it and from the small northern islands are obtained the white falcons, which are brought from here to the Sultan of Egypt, who pays from his treasury 1,000 dinars for them, and if the falcons arrive dead the reward is 500 dinars. And in their country is the white bear, which goes out into the sea and swims and catches fish, and these falcons seize what is left over by it, or what it has let alone. And on this they live, since there are no other flying creatures there on account of the severity of the frost. The skin of these bears is soft, and it is brought to the Egyptian lands as a gift. The island of White Falcons is supposed to be Iceland, known to Arabic geographers and represented, as we said, in the Al-Idrisi world map. Ibn Said does not indicate the nationality of the merchants who brought the birds to the Sultan of Egypt. However, it is hard to think that the Genoese totally neglected such a lucrative trade. The news reported by Galvanius about MARCKALADA, Markland, just like those about the less evanescent Greenland, remain isolated, and there is no trace of their reception either in continental geographical treatises or in the subsequent cartography. No mention of these lands is found in the Genoese Mappamondi or Portolands of the 14th century, nor in those produced in Majorca and Catalonia, closely linked with the Genoese tradition, although these maps make use of other notions gathered from travelers and merchants. The rumors about the lands of the extreme north and extreme west were perhaps too vague and indirect to be translated into a geographical representation. The only, very dubious trace of Markland in Mediterranean cartography could be connected with Madeira, whose Portuguese name means wooded land, land of lumber. The sailors who traveled the Atlantic, vaguely aware of the presence of some wooded land located westwards, just like Markland, might have identified it with a recently discovered island. In addition to the etymology, an element in favor of this theory is the fact that Madeira entered the European geographical horizon in Galvanius's time, around the middle of the 14th century, when it was reached, probably, just by Genoese navigators. On the other hand, however, Galvanius's MARCKALADA is not exactly described as a wooded land, but rather as a fertile land, with green trees, animals and a great quantity of birds, and the geographical location that he indicates, west of Greenland, apparently refers to a much more northerly area of the Atlantic than Madeira. Moreover, such features are quite commonly evoked in toponyms, and therefore this correlation might be accidental. Nonetheless, the possibility that the reminiscences of a normal source have been applied to the newly discovered island cannot be definitively ruled out. As far as Greenland is concerned, its earliest cartographic mentions in the Mediterranean area date back to the beginning of the 16th century and are too late to be significant. Apparently, there is no trace of any further erudite or scientific reception of the seafarers' rumors reported by Galvanius in his chronicle. This fact suggests a scenario of informality. The Genoese could exploit such notions for eventual commercial benefit, but they were too vague to find consistency of cartographic or scholarly representation. Despite its isolated position, Galvanius's narrative bears witness to the circulation of geographic knowledge between the Nordic and the Mediterranean world in the first half of the 14th century. Furthermore, it brings unprecedented evidence to the speculation that news about the American continent, derived from Nordic sources, may have circulated in Mediterranean, most likely Genoese, seafarer circles before Columbus. Long before Columbus, 1.5 centuries before him, to be exact. 1.